Welcome to the Creative Agency Success Show, the go-to resource for agency owners looking to scale their business. Join us every week to stay ahead of the curve and position your agency for future success.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's special episode. We're going to call this a fast forward episode. So a long time ago, and we were talking about a pre-show in 2019, and I can't believe we've been doing these podcasts for that long. Tom came on, and were Jody and I the hosts, or Adam and I the hosts at that time?
You and Jody, yeah.
So Jody and I were the host, and Tom came on. We talked. It was episode 14, using a forecast for growth. Tom came in and talked about one of his clients who, at the time, was under a really strong growth cycle. And so, 2019, obviously, if you look back at the timeline, we know what happened shortly thereafter. So we're going to get an update on Tom from this client and kind of the things we've learned and how that forecast worked. But I would definitely recommend going back and listening to that episode. There's a lot of really good tidbits in there about building a forecast. But Tom, how's the client doing? And how are you doing?
Yeah. So both are doing really well. So I would encourage people to listen, but I'll give you like the 30-second recap of what we said about the client. So in 2019, the client was $10 million. And what they said is we're going to be 20 million in 2020, and then we're going to be 30 million in 2021. And that's where we talked about the high growth. And I think we had some really good conversation about like, how do you approach a problem like that? I don't know if we talked about it during the podcast, but they also said, and the guy who's leading our business development is not in the right seat. And so they wanted to make that change. So that was a really big deal. So we continued. Jody said, look at the business model. We happen to have a lot of cash. And as you already mentioned, Jamie, so that was 2019. And then April 2020 is, pandemic hits and everything changed. And so just a couple things about that. Numbers wise, they were the same size in 2020. Right. So they went from 10 and stayed at about 10. Then they went to 16 million in 2021 and then 21 million in 2022. So well short of their growth, but they did grow. They doubled in 1 year and then grew 50% in the next year. But it was a wild journey sort of getting to that.
So let's talk about this is the beauty of forecasting, and this is why we talk about forecasting versus budgeting all the time. Because when you build a budget, you're basically creating a plan for the next year, and then things happen. Now, no one really expects a pandemic to happen, but things do happen, and so the question is how do you adjust, and what types of those conversations were you having at the time when they were expecting to go from 10 to 20 and they ended up being 10 to 10? So talk about the conversations and how the company felt during that time and how a forecast helped them along the way.
The forecast helped tremendously. And I'll mention one of the mistakes that we had made is knowing about this growth, we decentralized a lot of the budgeting and went out to everyone and said, hey, if we're growing this much, how many people do you need? And there were probably 15 people on their leadership team across the world they put a lot of work into number of people, which roles, organization, tools, all this kind of stuff. Sort of as soon as it hit, they then centralized all the hiring decisions and basically said, we're not going to go out and hire for all this growth. We can't hire at all. That caused a fair amount of frustration internally from the people who I had all these plans and I was planning on adding people, and now they're having multiple conversations around, well, reality is we're not growing. But your question was around forecast. We updated the forecast very quickly, and it was mostly like the 2 or 3 month term initially, where we initially kept the $20 million target. But as you can imagine, not very much growth ended up being huge growth toward the end of the year, like these months of 4 and 5 times as big as they are today if you're going to hit that. So that was April. And then we started backing off the 20, okay, this is an unrealistic goal now.
So if that company was doing just an annual budget versus doing monthly forecasting, how would have things been different for them, you think?
It's a great question. If they actually lived to their budget, I think they would have spent according to their budget and probably started hiring people and probably doing some of the internal projects where realistically they said, if we're this big, we need better project management and portfolio management kind of tools. It's easier when we're small. Now that we're huge, we need tools. They probably would have started spending that money preparing for it and not adjusted, would be my guess.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's about those conversations, right? So I think in a situation where there's a pandemic or there's something like that, yeah, we probably would have had the conversations and we would have talked about it. But I'm guessing that wouldn't have happened until June or July when a lot of that money was already spent. Where if you're having that conversation and it's part of your routine every month to look at that forecast, you're going to at least buy yourself 2 to 3 months, which in the business world is a big, big difference, especially when it comes to making those big decisions like hiring and other spending costs.
Yeah. And it's funny as I thought back some of the things, whether you're growing really fast or not growing at all, a lot of things around your forecast aren't different. You need to be all over your forecast and understanding that. And it becomes really important in sort of those 2 points that you're looking at that you can handle doing both of those things.
So let's talk about the next year. Okay, so they went from 10 to 10, and then they realized, okay, now we're going to have that growth. So the fact that you had that forecast that already existed, that we knew what
Mhm.
the growth was going to look like, did you just jump right back into that forecast, or did you do things separately, differently the second time around?
Great question. The one learning that we did have was we did more of a centralized forecast.
Okay.
They said initially, look, we'll manage the growth of the people. So when I think our plan for 2021 was a little bit bigger than the 16 million they hit. I think they hit more like 18 million is sort of what we had forecasted. Realizing what we had done the year before, though, I helped them and said, it's going to be about this number of people. We're going to, and I don't remember the numbers exactly, but we're going to go from 100 to say 190 people. And we think it's like in these geographies. And they looked and they said, yes, that's really reasonable. So we didn't go to the individual team leaders to get that information. And then as we started growing, then we were saying, okay, we're going to hire this many. They had people requesting hires and we were using the forecast. So I think that was one of our really good learnings from that piece.
And so do you think that made it easier the second time around, was having that centralized hiring program, and it made it a little bit easier for them to get to that number they had in the third year?
It did. It probably put more pressure on the VP of Ops, who was one of the owners, that he was making every single individual hire decision. And he was willing, but that meant he was telling a lot of people no. I think that it probably actually would have been harder for him to just sort of let the reins off and then have other people hiring. And then he sort of felt like that was out of control. The other thing that happened during that time, Jamie, was they also brought in a different sales leader. So during 2020,
Hmm.
got rid of the other person who happened to have been an owner, and that was a sort of painful emotional thing for them to go through, and then got who they thought was the right guy. And so it's good to work with him because he came up with some pretty good initial sales plans around, here's the organization I need, here's where we're going to get the work, like this many enterprise customers, this many new, here's what we can count on from existing, and then it's this many sales calls, qualified leads, things like that. And so he built a really nice looking plan to start off with, which really helped in my planning side.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. It's, adding that new team member in there sometimes brings in a fresh perspective, and especially if depending on where they've come
Mhm.
from, I think that's the beauty of business, is everybody has different experiences they can pull from. So I mean, just talk about what are some of those experiences that he brought in, and some of the things that he may have added to that growth cycle.
Yeah, having worked for a bigger company, there's lots of different I guess, points of tension in companies, but one of them is the real experts who do the work, like the architects and people like that, they get pulled into business development things.
Hmm.
So there's this tension of I can't get sort of the real work done because sales keeps pulling on me, and sales, of course, is saying I can't sell if the experts aren't in here. And he understood that piece. And then as he came in, he said, you don't really have the right people in the role. You've hired some junior salespeople who all they really know how to do is sort of fill out paperwork and ask questions. Let's get a few more experienced people who can do some of the upfront technical stuff. And then as things progress, then we can pull on the technical people, but they can at least handle those first couple conversations. And it felt like that was the right move for him to come in and make.
Yeah, then I think that makes a lot of
Yep. And so
sense,
that
because
that was a
yeah,
really good thing that they had done.
yeah, I think you see that a lot, the tension between sales and the operations, and how that works. And so I think having someone with that
Sure.
outside perspective that's seen it at a small company, the company kind of where they want to get, and kind of see how that works, is nice to bring in that perspective. So let's fast
Now,
forward to today. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
the one other point I was going to make, since we talked about our tools, we have our pipeline meeting.
Mm,
One of the real successes that we had in there was I was continuing. So as they grow fast, they didn't have enough people for some of the specific kind of work. And this was tough on the sales guy. He started telling customers, we have to wait 6 weeks to start projects because we don't have the resources. That didn't come out until it was in one of our pipeline meetings where we review all the pipeline kind of stuff. And I focused on that assumption, said, here's everything we're doing, here's when revenue is going to flow. That same VP of operations literally flipped out during that. And he was sort of in this, you're telling customers or prospects what? And they had a good discussion slash argument that apparently for a couple specific roles, that was true. But in his mind, by and large, for 90%, they could start the work today, but there are these couple of roles. And that wouldn't have come out if we
mhm.
didn't have these kind of discussions about what do opportunities look like and things like that. And it really made a big change And so, as you know, there are times that some of our meetings are just getting people in the right room focused on the data, and they have the kind of conversations that they should be having, but they don't because there's not a forum for it.
Yeah, I think it's the one part that I know we talk about internally a ton, but maybe we don't talk about on this podcast enough, or maybe even to like when
Hmm.
we do our presentations, is how closely tied together that pipeline meeting is with the forecasting meeting, right? Like
Yes.
we can you can build a forecast. The example I always use is VCRs, right? Like I could build a forecast
Hmm.
tomorrow that says I'm going to sell 1 million VCRs, right? Like
Yep.
I could easily build that forecast on a spreadsheet, but if there's no demand for VCRs and no one's going to buy VCRs, like why would I have that forecast, right? And so like,
Yes.
that's kind of what that pipeline meeting is it's determining that demand. It's determining how much are we actually going to have versus our capacity, and what hiring decisions do we need to make, or what other decisions do we need to make that are even more difficult. So those meetings
Yeah.
really need to be looked at as co-meetings in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a great point. And then you asked for an update on where they are
Yeah.
today.
Uh-huh.
Yep. So that was back in 19. I continued working them until late last year, so late 2023.
Okay.
We helped them grow to where they were 22, $23 million for that year. And we helped them add some internal team members, helped them with their processes, but then realistically got to the point of saying, okay, your business is complicated enough also. Having a full-time person to do this does make sense, whereas on the fractional basis probably didn't make sense. So we helped them with that transition, but they were doing really well, and nothing but a success story from my mind.
So let's talk about that. I mean, I think this is a conversation that obviously we're fractional CFOs, so we're here to say,
Yep.
hey, fractional CFOs is the way to go. But at some point, it does get to the point where a fractional CFO is just not going to cut it. Like, I don't think it's a dollar point that is that. What do you feel like are those triggers, or it's like, okay, we probably need to start looking to hire a full time person to manage our numbers?
It's a great question. I agree. I don't think it's just straight dollars. The complexity is one, and they did 3 or 4 different types of work and were really interested in the profitability. And we could help with that, but they really want to dig in and manage that. And we didn't have the time to say, okay, we can sort of be a CFO on each project. And that is what they were looking for. And so their team got very engaged in the individual projects. And that was one that helped an awful lot. Geographically, they were diverse, and that was fine, except for you started getting laws in the individual countries that they wanted help from financial, and it was a little bit more than what I understood. They were mostly Latin American countries, but there were some special banking laws and tax laws and things like that that they wanted that expertise. So it was probably more the complexity than anything that was in there.
No, I agree. I think it's complexity, and I think how you can tell when you get to that point is when the more and more conversations you have, the more finance comes up, right? Like at some
Hmm.
point, and again, it doesn't really have to do with size. It just has to do with the decisions you're making and how complex you are as a business. Is that if every day or every couple times a day you're making a decision, you're like, oh, we need a finance person involved in this conversation. We need a finance person
Yes.
involved in this conversation. That's probably not right to have an outsourced person because you're not going to be able to get hold of them 3 or 4 times a day to have
Right.
those conversations. But early on, when you're first developing that complexity, once a week is really sufficient because you can kind of hold all those questions, have a meeting, get them
Hmm.
all answered, then move on. So I think that's kind of the one thing that I noticed is the clients that get to that point where they're ready to move on. It's like every day they're having these really complex questions where you have to bring in
It's a great
experts, you have
point.
to bring in people that just really need to help you answer those questions to move the business
Right.
forward.
Yeah, yeah, that's an excellent point. And as they got bigger, they didn't really have systems to help with some of that. So even some easy things like they were never good at time entry kind of stuff. Having a person on the ground for projects who could actually sort of shepherd that along and get it there was really
Mhm.
good. Where I was pointing out to them, clearly if you look at your numbers, people aren't entering correctly. And they were saying how hard it was, but they wanted ownership for that. And so an internal employee could take ownership better than us doing it fractionally, where people just didn't listen as much to the external people doing it.
All right, so my final question here is let's
Yeah.
pretend like I'm listening to this podcast. I paused it after you told me to go back and listen to the original.
Uh-huh.
Now I came back and just listened to it, and I'm like, okay, what are the two things that Tom thinks I should take from this story? The Where they were, where they ended up, and how they got there. Like, what are the two things me as a business owner should take from this kind of path this company went
Oh,
down?
that's an excellent question. Let me think for just one second. One of them seems obvious. Okay, I can think of the two. We continue to emphasize the dynamic forecast, and to me, that is huge to have that work and support you in sort of whatever model of the business to be there, to where we're then saying, okay, if this is what you want to do, let's make sure this is what it looks like, and what are the most important things that are going to keep you from doing that. One I didn't mention, for example, the team growing that much, they were in small enough countries that they literally said, we don't think we can find the talent in that country. So this means we move to multiple countries. Those kind of discussions they probably wouldn't have had when you throw out a number that sounds nice, 20 million in 2020. That is a nice ring to it. That's probably the one. And then I think the other that I would say is, I think maybe I'm saying some of the same thing, but what are the most important barriers that are going to keep you from hitting that goal, and continuing to keep attention on those and saying, can you measure what those things are? If it's growth in people, if it's delayed time, things like that.
Yeah, I think both those are great, and obviously we talk a lot about the dynamic forecast, so I won't touch much on that. But I think the other one is really important, and I think that's why a lot of companies go towards EOS and have those rocks, is because it keeps you focused on what are those barriers, what are those 2 or 3 things that are going to keep us from getting to where we want to get, and how do we make sure those don't happen. And again, sometimes they're outside, and there's things you can't control about them, but like sometimes it is like we're never going to hit 20 million unless we're able to hire 100 people. That's obviously a barrier. So that could be a rock. Like, okay, how can we make sure we can hire 100 people over the next 3 years? Or, another barrier might be is if we want to grow this company to 25 million, we need an amazing sales team. So how do we put a rock together to not only hire amazing salespeople, but build an amazing sales process? And so to me, that's really the value of EOS. It helps you identify what your forecast is, which is what we do, build you a forecast, but then what are those goals that you really need to accomplish in order to hit that? And so that's why we push some type of goal setting on a pretty frequent basis, whether it's EOS or whatever model you decide to go down.
Yeah. I think that's an excellent point to emphasize, that what I was pointing is out, you can point to those things and say, this is going to be important, but then having them say, okay, this is different than how we behave today. How are we going to chase it? And like your point, if they're not good at setting goals and chasing them, that might be one to say, you need to get this in place, because this isn't just going to happen sort of on its own, that everything kind of rises up to this level. That it won't be that case.
Yeah, I think as a business, you need to be focused. And I know, Tom, you and I have talked about this several times, just talking about, Anders and Summit, of like, sometimes we are like trying to work on 20 things at once, and we do a poor job on all 20 of them, where it's like, we should just focus on these 3 or 4 things and do an excellent job in those 3 or 4, make sure we got those wrapped up, then let's move on to the next ones. And so I just remember, like, probably around the time of this podcast, you and I having some of those conversations about, hey, maybe we should shift our goals a little bit more and focus on some of these things. So it's there for every business.
I agree. You take sort of any group, business or department, and do like what should we start doing? What should we keep doing? What should we stop doing? Every group is going to have a huge start list, and like a medium continue, and they can never think of anything to stop, yet they'll say we're too busy. But I would argue, like the rocks, if you pick 2 or 3 things and actually get them done, you'll be much happier than making a smidgen of project progress on like a bunch of things that are done. So
that's
the
my
way
favorite
we
thing
use rocks now, I really like it. You and I are working on one now that's great.
Yeah, and I think that's my favorite thing about going down that path is like every year I can look back and be like, wow, look at the 12 things we accomplished, because we bid them, broke them down into quarters, completed them in that quarter, and then moved on. Like it's nice to be able to look back and see all the things we've accomplished and how we've changed. And I think that's the only way to grow, is to really take that. The expression I use, which I'm sure is pretty common, is there's really only one way to eat an elephant, right? One bite at a time. Like you can't try to do too much of it, right? So that's really the way to do it.
Wouldn't you agree, though, even though you like that approach, I like that approach, it's still hard when you list the rocks to say we're not going to focus on certain things. It seems like every time we're in one of those meetings, we always have more things that we want to put on the list, right? Our person says, I think, no more than 7. And we always will say, yeah, but these 11 sure are important. And I think that's really smart, but it's always hard decisions. There's never really silly things you're like, yeah, we could easily do without that. Those don't even make the first cut. So it's not easy.
And that's where I think it goes back to having a strong forecast in place, right? Like having a strong forecasting process really should make it easier to eliminate it. Like, okay, this 7th project would be a nice to have, but is it really one of the top 7 things we need to do in order to hit our goals?
Great point. Yeah.
Cool, Tom. Well, this is a fun podcast for me, because first off, when we first started talking, I didn't even realize we've been doing podcasts for 5 years. So that makes me feel like that's crazy.
Old.
Old, and I'm like, I'm surprised I'm not any better at this after 5 years. Like, man, I better just really a little more practice.
Well, it was fun to go back and listen to it. Like, wow, 5 years ago, how did I describe these kinds of things? So it was fun for me to remember it too.
For sure. But yeah, I appreciate coming up with this topic and us being a chance to revisit it. So this was fun.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yep, thank you.
Enjoy this podcast? Visit our website, summitcpa.net, to get more tips and strategy for achieving business success. We're here to be a resource in this ever-changing industry.